Okay, that brings us to the forerunners of the Reformation. We get to our first biography. So the first one is an American. It would be John Wycliffe. In English, British English, it would be Wycliffe. So I may use either one. He's born sometime in the 1320s. We don't know exactly when. He's born in Ipswell in Yorkshire, England. He's as England as the day is long, or English as the day is long. 1340, he attends the Queen's College of Oxford, so he's an Oxford man. 1348, the bubonic plague sweeps through the Oxford area. 1356, he publishes Last Age of the Church, which opposes the earthly or temporal rule of clergy. I bet that went over big among the clergy and among the Catholic hierarchy. 1360, he disputes with mendicant friars. Now, mendicant friars are ones who go around from town to town begging. And he actually had a debate, would probably be putting it too strong. But a series of arguments, and some of them in public, where he thought mendicant friars were just selfish, wanted everybody else to support him. 1361, he becomes the master of Balliol College in Oxford, and he is ordained a priest in the See of Lincoln. And he becomes a priest of the parish of Fyllingham in Lincolnshire. So here we see the first example of a reformer who was actually a member of the Catholic hierarchy. 1365, he's appointed the head or warden of Canterbury Hall, Oxford, by Simon Islip, Archbishop of Canterbury. And I put this one in mostly because his wardenship ended in 1366 when Islip dies, which shows it's not what you know, it is who you know. 1368, he's the rector of Ludkershaw in Buckinghamshire. And it's way in 1372, so he's getting up there in years already. He becomes a novitiate to receive a doctorate of theology. 1374, crown living of Lutterworth in Leicestershire. This basically means that he now has a pension from the crown. He's actually being paid to do what he does. So far, I would say we haven't really run into anything that would justify him being considered the morning star of the Reformation. I think we're reaching that point now. 1374 to 76, he publishes Tractatus de Civili Dominio, which called for the church to renounce earthly or temporal rule. And again, you can imagine how popular this would have made with the Catholic hierarchy. Now, when he published his Last Days of the Church, that was in 1356. He wasn't a priest yet. He wasn't on a pension from the priest. Now he's a pretty well-known guy. I mean, for Pete's sakes, he was the master of Balliol College, a warden of Canterbury Hall, etc., etc. And he publishes this tract, which became pretty popular. And it was pretty widespread. 1377, the Pope condemned 18 propositions of Wycliffe's Tractatus de Civili Dominio in 5 separate bulls. He couldn't just list them in one bull. He had to publish 5 separate bulls saying how Wycliffe was wrong.
Shows how many you are. It's in that 5 separate units.
Now here's where some interesting things start to happen, because if this had been the 11th century and the 12th century, papal bull, 5 papal bulls against Wycliffe, never heard from him. But this wasn't. This is later than that. This is the 14th century. He's brought before William Courtenay, the Bishop of London, for questioning. But he shows up with a bunch of powerful friends, including John of Gaunt, who was essentially running the kingdom at that point. He's not king, but he's the head advisor to the king. And he actually walks into this hearing with Wycliffe and sits there with his arms crossed and he isn't going to let some bishop do anything to Wycliffe. March 1378, he appears at the Episcopal Palace at Lambeth to defend his writings. And an angry crowd supports him outside the hearing. So while this hearing is going on, there's this mob outside with pitchforks, and they're screaming and yelling and chanting through the whole set of hearings. And the bishops, this is a whole group of bishops are reviewing him. And basically, the bishops get a little scared, and they finally tell Wycliffe to shut up, and they let him go. Just stop saying that stuff. 1379, Wycliffe blasts the papacy in his book, De Officio Regis, roughly the office of king. 1381, he publishes De Eucharistia, in which he blasts the doctrine of transubstantiation. You can see we are getting further and further away from Catholic theology. 1381 to 1384, he begins the first full English translation of the Bible. There had never been a complete English translation of the Bible before. Now, many years before, like 600 years before, a cowherder named Cadman had actually translated some of the Psalms into Anglo-Saxon. But this is the first real translation of the Bible. And you'll note it's a translation of the translations from Jerome's Vulgate. And it's published in 1388. In 1382, William Courtenay, Archbishop of Canterbury, calls for a group of bishops to meet in London to condemn Wycliffe. 10 of his propositions are declared heretical. Not as many as the Pope had proclaimed. November 17, 1382, summoned before a synod at Oxford, but because of support from Parliament, nothing happens to him. So here's a guy who has the the king's chief advisor on his side. He's got Parliament on his side. He actually had the Queen Mother herself on his side. Around 1384, he publishes Trialogus. It's a kind of a summation of his theological views. December 28, 1384, suffers a stroke while performing Mass. December 30th, 1384, he dies in Lutterworth, Leicestershire, in England. You think that would be the end of our biography, but it's not. In 1401, anti-Wycliffe statutes are passed, allows persecution of Wycliffe's followers, and a whole group had grown up called the Lollards, who were followers of Wycliffe. Some people call these the first Protestants. I think the Moravians might have a disagreement with that. 1408, Constitutions of Oxford bans his writings and declares unauthorized translations of the Bible to be heretical. So when he's at Oxford, the students he's like a rock superstar when he's at Oxford. So they had to do something to suppress his writings. May 4th, 1415, condemned by the Council of Constance for 267 heresies. It is my goal in my life before I die that a Catholic council condemns me for 268 heresies. But it hasn't happened.
30 years after he died, too.
I don't think he cared.
1428, his remains are dug up and burned on papal order and cast into the river Swift at Lutterworth. And later this will be viewed with great symbology by the later Protestants. He is called by many the morning star of the Reformation because he had a lot of ideas that by the 16th century kind of formed the basis of the Reformation. And maybe just as importantly, the next person we're going to talk about, which is John Huss, or Jan Hus. Huss's whole career was propagating the theology of Wycliffe. So you kind of have this unbroken thread going from Wycliffe to Huss and to Zwingli and Luther. This wonderful painting here shows that Wycliffe reading his translation of the Bible to the king's chief advisor, John of Gaunt, which which kind of tells you why he was allowed to do what he did as long as he did. So what were some of his beliefs? He believed good works did not guarantee salvation. Rather, good works are a sign that you're saved. He believed in predestination. He believed that only Adam and Eve had free will. And boy, did they blow. All Christians are priests. You didn't need confession or the confessional. You didn't need to have any earthly intermediaries between you and Christ. The Bible is the preeminent authority for every Christian. And heck, every Christian should be able to read the Bible. Shocking stuff. Rejected the sale of indulgences, which was happening even then, but not on the widespread industrial scale that would happen in the 16th century. Criticized the excesses of clergy. Wycliffe believed that they should be tried by secular courts when they broke the law instead of by ecclesiastical courts. Generally, members of clergy in medieval Europe were tried by ecclesiastical courts, not by secular courts. It's always a problem when you think someone has been doing something wrong, and the body that you report the wrongdoing to is a body whose sole reason for existence is to support the people you've reported. Denial of transubstantiation. Wycliffe, kind of like Luther, believed in a real presence of Christ during the Eucharist, spiritually, truly, really, effectively, but didn't believe in a chemical change in the actual elements. So this guy sounds like a Protestant. I mean, he walks like a Protestant, he talks like a Protestant, quacks like a Protestant. This is from his Trilogus. As the pride of those who hate God ever tends upward, so below the fountainhead of error takes its rise in the very beginning of darkness, the rivulet of the friars strives unnaturally to raise itself above its source. I confess that the indulgences of the Pope, if they are what they are said to be, are a manifest blasphemy, inasmuch as he claims the power to save men almost without limit, not only to mitigate the penalties of those who have sinned, by granting them the aid of absolutions and indulgences, that they may never come to purgatory, but to give command to the holy angels, that when the soul is separated from the body, they may carry it without delay to its everlasting rest. Well, he kind of socks it to some pretty core Catholic beliefs right there. I like that basically bypass purgatory, the angels will carry you to heaven. And all you got to do is
free card.
Yeah.
pay here.
Yeah. It's not getting a jail free card.
That's not from jail.
Now, Wycliffe also believed in communal ownership by the righteous, pointing to the famous passages in Acts. And he believed the church and the clergy should own no earthly goods, which of course would not make him popular with the clergy or the hierarchy.
He was just wrapping them up.
These were not necessarily views of the later reformers. That's why they're kind of in the room section. His supporters, he had an interesting bunch of supporters. He had a lot of supporters among the nobility as well as among the populace. The populace by this point, not big fans of the friars, they're not big fans of the monasteries. A lot of times the monasteries were their landlords. How many people love their landlord? Or the bank that calls their
HOA.
Yeah, or their HOA. He was strongly supported by John of Gaunt, the first Duke of Lancaster, who had great influence during the minority of his nephew, Richard II. This is not the Lionheart, this is Richard II. John of Gaunt actually showed up at Wycliffe's February 19, 1377 hearing before William Courtenay, Bishop of London, to offer his support for Wycliffe. And if you've got to go to a trial, this is the kind of person who won't show up. Citizens of Lambeth surrounded the place of the meeting. Numbers forced their way into the chapel where the synod was assembled, proclaiming their attachment to the person and doctrine of Wycliffe. The dismay produced by this tumult was augmented when Sir Lewis Clifford entered the chapel, and in the name of the Queen Mother, forbade the bishops proceed to any definite sentence concerning the conduct or opinions of the reform. So here he's got the crowd on the side with the pitchforks and the torches. And then somebody shows up and says, I'm here on behalf of the Queen Mother. And she says, you don't do not do this. Powerful friends, just like Luther later had. His legacy influence on later reformers such as Martin Luther and Tyndale and Huss. First medieval theologian to publish a Bible in the vernacular. He did most of the New Testament translation himself. A friend of his, Nicholas of Hereford, did most of the Old Testament translation. Small group of Wycliffe's followers named the Lollers, which means poor priests, struggled on after his death, but never became an influential group. The River Swift. 1428, Wycliffe's remains were dug up and burned on papal order and cast into the River Swift at Waterloo. And later, Thomas Ford wrote, the brook bore them to the Avon bore them to the Severn bore them to the narrow seas, and the narrow seas into the main ocean. And thus the ashes of John Wycliffe are the emblem of his doctrine, which is now dispersed the wide world.
More importantly, the reason the Roman Catholic Church would dig him up and burn his remains were if you were convicted by the Roman Catholic Church and were burned, the state church then had the right to confiscate all of your possessions and lands.
And it was true after you were dead.
Yes, to your successors. And so they could go back anything that he had claim over, his followers had claim over, they could then confiscate.